competition law modified by a court. Today we'll be talking about a specific court ruling and the fact that it has modified a competition law. And it has broader implications throughout the entire U.S. So we'll jump into it today. Should be informative for those of you that are business owners, business leaders that are thinking about growing your business and also starting to understand that the important role that government regulation plays into the potential growth and development of your business. So what we have here is a cross-state dispute that I'm going to jump into, and there's a link below to the actual article that came out of Pacific Legal. But basically, we have an Ohio company that runs an ambulance service, and they wanted to cross the line over into Kentucky to pick some folks up and help them with their medical needs. The issue being that Kentucky has a certificate of need requirement, and the Ohio company couldn't get that certificate of need. They couldn't prove that people needed their service, and that certificate of need largely came from other companies in Kentucky. So, of course, if you ask your competitors, do we need more people in this space? Most times the competitor is going to say no, right? There's plenty of us here. We're already having a hard time in business. We're trying to make ends meet, blah, 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 right? A lot of people aren't going to be wild about bringing more competition in. So you almost have a non-starter in that if you ask people if they want more competition, they're probably going to say no. And so this got brought to a federal court, and now it's a federal issue because of the crossing of the state lines, which really changes the analysis. In fact, the court said if this was solely within Kentucky, we're not going to look into it, right? That's a Kentucky issue. But when we start crossing state lines, we have interstate commerce, right? It's one of the clauses in the U.S. Constitution that the U.S. government gets to regulate interstate commerce. And so when we start getting into interstate commerce issues, we turn from necessarily being potentially just a state issue into being a federal issue. And the Commerce Clause has a long, tortured history. And it's very surprising where things will fall as far as whether they're interstate commerce or not. Some surprising things might be interstate commerce, such as growing wheat on your private farm for use within your farm has been held long ago by the U.S. Supreme Court to be interstate commerce because of the effects of your growing of corn on the wheat on the world or the national wheat market. And so a lot of surprising things can be interstate commerce. As soon as we get into interstate commerce, we get to potentially federal U.S. constitutional jurisdiction. And that's what happened here, is this court came in and looked at this ambulance company crossing from Ohio to Kentucky to potentially pick up some passengers as being interstate commerce because you have two different states interacting. And as such, we go back under the U.S. Constitution and we look at what requirements can be put on interstate commerce. And essentially, when it becomes interstate commerce, it becomes federal jurisdiction. And we have both the Active Commerce Clause, where Congress has come in and put actual regulations around it. And then we have what they call the Dormant Commerce Clause, where the failure of action by Congress or the federal government to regulate shows that maybe they just don't want the states dealing with the issue. So in all this complex analysis, this court looked at the facts here. Ohio Ambulance Company, medical transport company, Kentucky with the certificate of need requirements, and the fact you need to get approval within Kentucky. And they said that was just too much burden on interstate commerce, that you can't make an Ohio company comply with all of these, strange or different Kentucky requirements. And so, at least to some extent here, the U.S. federal constitution has actually protected some companies from some regulation. Now, on the flip side, looking at the broader picture, a lot of the U.S. government's power in modern era comes from the interpretation of the Commerce Clause, right? Because so much touches interstate commerce, right? And many of your federal agencies derive their power from their regulation of interstate commerce. The fact that there is interstate commerce is the reason why many federal agencies can exist and why they have regulatory authority. This case largely went the other direction. The court said, hey, too much federal authority. We can't allow this to cross over into Kentucky, preventing Ohio companies from doing business in Kentucky. Now, the court said Kentucky can do whatever it basically wants to do with Kentucky companies. So if Kentucky wants to be so ill-advised that it restricts competition within its in-state market, what they call the intra versus intrastate, within the state market, they're free to do so. That's not going to be a U.S. federal constitutional issue. So that tells you kind of where the water's edge is, right? If you are within a state and your state is potentially over-regulating you or potentially passing competition laws that are making it difficult, you are not going to necessarily be able to invoke the U.S. Constitution to protect you. You are then going to have to look at your state law, your state constitution, look at the broader system, and figure out how you get a remedy within that system. So what is powerful about this is that this opens the door to businesses crossing state lines. And in certain parts of the country in particular, this is a very big thing. You get into some of the huge states, Texas, Florida, California, you may do a lot of within the state commerce, right? When I first moved to Texas, somebody told me, you'll see a lot of Texas license plates. You won't see a lot of out-of-state license plates. And that's not because people don't travel. It's just because people are traveling within Texas. And you have so many large cities that people are actually traveling from one large city to the other, but they still had Texas license plates. But from the U.S. Constitution, that's all intrastate commerce and not necessarily part of the U.S. Federal Commerce Clause. But in smaller states in the Northeast where I was raised, people cross state lines regularly, right? It's commonplace to go from one state to another. In fact, at one point I owned a house in one state, and I would cross into the other state to make a U-turn and come back and go to work every day. So I would literally be crossing into two states every day just to do my normal morning commute. But that's more common up in the Northeast and other regions where the states are packed together, that people start crossing state lines. This is a very important holding up in that, original 13 colonies area where people are so often crossing state lines. But today, also with internet, mail order, and some other services, delivery, etc., there are crossing of state lines. So anybody who's now crossing state lines at least has some guidance to point to and potentially some protection. Now you have to remember, this holding came out of what is called the Sixth Circuit of the U.S., and that's a regional U.S. federal court, and that holding is generally only applicable to the Sixth Circuit. So the way the federal system works is you have the federal trial courts, and then you have Court of Appeals, and then, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court. The Court of Appeals has a region that it covers, and the holding, or whatever the court finds, applies to that region directly. So anybody within that Sixth Circuit footprint in and around Ohio can potentially rely and benefit from this decision and apply it to similar facts. Now, as you go further out into other circuits, those circuits aren't necessarily held to what the Sixth Circuit found. Now, a lot of times they will agree and find it persuasive, but they may not necessarily agree. Sometimes we get a divide between the circuits, and that's how we end up in the U.S. Supreme Court a lot. The U.S. Supreme Court, many of the cases it picks because there's a divide among the circuits. And so they are trying to harmonize the law and make it uniform. And so people are always talking about going to the Supreme Court and getting their day at the highest court in the land. on constitutional and other issues. And one way that you increase your likelihood of making it into the U.S. Supreme Court is to have an issue where the circuits have disagreed, where they have reached conflicting opinions. So good news within the Sixth Circuit, potentially okay news throughout the entire U.S., that this court is saying, these state requirements that are trying to block interstate folks from coming in and potentially competing is a no-go. And so you as a business owner can now think more about expanding across state lines. For some class of businesses, this may have opened the door. If you happen to have similar facts as this case, you may now have the ability to go in and make your own challenge to the legality, or potentially maybe the state that you're trying to get into will back off on some of its licensing requirements when they see this case come through. So the good news is it should open some interstate competition. As business owners, as business growth-oriented companies, that's something that we like, right? We like to be able to get out and engage in commerce and don't like to have so much regulation put over top of what we can and can't do. So some class of people just had the door swung open by this court. Of course, now some people who didn't want the competition now have new competitors, right? So at least in this Kentucky market, it looks like they'll have a new ambulance company coming in and taking people back and forth to Ohio, which will now change the market for them. And I don't know from the article whether these Kentucky companies that didn't want the Ohio company coming to Kentucky were able to go into Ohio and do business, or how all that was working. I would love to hear your comments on that if that's something you're familiar with. But now the door should be open. And that was one of the ideas of the original U.S. Constitution. This is something that was considered in the founding of the country, and that's why there is an interstate commerce clause. The founders wanted people to be able to do business across state lines, travel, engage in commerce, and not really be treated like second-class citizens because they live in different states. Imagine a world where one state treats the citizens of another state as second-class citizens. It's not something we think about here in the U.S. because we have these constitutional protections, but you could see it being a natural and probable consequence if we didn't have the constitutional protections, that a lot of people would say, well, let's keep the business within our state. Let's not let the out-of-staters come in here. Let's not let the out-of-staters compete against us. Let's keep all the money for ourselves, and let's control our local market. The U.S. Constitution is designed to prohibit that. Here, the court has jumped in on it. Links below, including an analysis by Steve Leto. He has a fantastic YouTube channel. I see some ideas. Every once in a while, I'll pick up one of his videos and do it here on our channel because his topics are so good. He did a video on this. I gave you a completely different take and analysis on it. He gives his take and analysis, so you may want to go check that out. If you're new here, click some buttons. If you're a new subscriber, leave me a comment. Say, hey, I'm a new subscriber. Would love to interact with you. I'll try to reply if I can. And also, whether you're a new subscriber or not, let me know some topics you want covered on future videos, and I'll try to get those worked in for you. I always like to hear what you guys are thinking about. It gives me ideas for videos, allows me to tune in the content to be more valuable, and we can go from there. All right, folks, looking forward to seeing those comments, likes, shares, all of that. And if you want to, consider subscribing to our channel.